Yet another beautiful day for us to meet and interact on different topics of our common interest. So, respected Principal Chako Jo Sir, who has been an active participant of our sessions throughout and the backbone of our college, we welcome you to yet another session of our Chrysalis. Welcome, sir. The lecturer of the day, Dr. Nandini C. Sen, Associate Professor, Bharati College. The research guides present here, who has been our constant moral support and ever inspiring. The research scholars and all the teachers and others who are present here. On behalf of the entire Chrysalis team, I welcome you all to today's invited lecture. I'm CM Mira, research scholar at the Research and Postgraduate Department of English, St. Aloysius College, Thrissur. Chrysalis, a commemorative weekly lecture series, is organized in fond remembrance of our beloved teachers, Dr. Danya Menon, who was Associate Professor at Prajodi Niketan College, Pudukkad, Thrissur, and also a research supervisor at the Department of English, St. Aloysius College, Thrissur. Father Anthony Kuttikat, CMI, who started his career as a junior lecturer in English at St. Aloysius College, and Professor M.T. Paul Davis, who was the HOD of the Department of English, St. Aloysius College, Thrissur. Chrysalis aims at providing a platform for the research scholars to make presentations on the topic of their research interests and thus brainstorm the creative and critical faculties of the scholars, to force them always think out of the box and to be more receptive to the ever-geared changes happening in their respective fields of research. Today, the Research and Postgraduate Department of English, St. Aloysius College, Thrissur, is hosting the fourth invited lecture in its series. We have with us today Dr. Nandini C. Sen, Associate Professor at Bharati College, affiliated to Delhi University, and also a very proactive, dedicated, and insightful academic writer. Am I audible? Okay, thank you. Okay, researcher, right? Sorry for the interruption. So, a very proactive, dedicated, and insightful academic researcher, writer, critic, and editor with a series of publications to her credit, in order to enlighten us topic, the pandemic seen through the literary lens. Ms. Sen was a fellow at the prestigious Indian Institute of Advanced Study, Shimla, and also a proud recipient of Charles Wallace Fellowship for Academic Research in London. Her short stories have been featured in literary journals such as the Elusive Genre and the Muse. She has also been featured in the Asian Collective of Short Stories and the Australia-India collaboration titled The Glass Valley. Her latest book is titled The Second Wife and Other Stories, which came out in 2022. She's also a very keen observer of the second wave of the pandemic, and overall, it has been a nightmare, a never-ending nightmare, if one may put it that way. So I did a bit of back research, and I found this very interesting thing, which I'm going to share with you today, that from a very long time, so pandemic is something that is not new to the society by any stretch of imagination. It has been there since time immemorial. The historians have been talking about it, and literature has been talking and documenting it. See, the fun part about literature is that it gets written, it gets talked about. But such as our lives are, we forget our history and we never take the literature seriously. And that is one reason why, when it affects us, we are traumatized, because we run around like headless chicken, not knowing what we are supposed to do when everything has been written down, talked about, discussed, and has been happening for a very long time now. So I want to take you through, it's impossible to document every piece of literature that has been written about the pandemic, but I'm focusing on some of the seminal pieces of work which many of you would have read or would have some idea about. And then I will also bring in a bit of the Indian example I'm sure those authors, again, you all are familiar with. And
eventually leading to the current situation. So, presenting to you all the pandemic seen through the literary lens. How does literature look at pandemic, and how does literature evaluate and understand pandemic? And if and that's a very big if, had we been aware citizens, had we studied our history, had we known our literature, could our understanding of pandemic been somewhat different? That is a question that I throw at you. It obviously does not have a specific answer, but we can always take it up and discuss it later. Okay. So this is something that, these are lines and phrases that we often use. So plagued by death, it's an oft repeated phrase. And it comes to us from Camus' novel. He wrote a novel called The Plague, which interestingly came out when our country became free, that is 1947. And what does Camus say in this? And I quote him. He says, "Nobody is capable of really thinking about anyone, even in the worst calamity. We can't stir a finger in the world without the risk of bringing death to somebody. Yes, I've been ashamed ever since I have realized that we all have plague, and I have lost my peace." This is what Camus writes in 1947. Why is he writing this? Well, he says that human beings can be just so monstrously selfish that it is entirely about my safety. I should be fine. Nothing should happen to me. Nothing should happen to my family. I feel sorry that things are happening to other people, but we should remain safe. So a certain kind of monstrous selfishness that the human beings are capable of displaying. Camus is extremely critical of that, and he mocks it. So he says that the very fact that we are so selfish, that in itself results in death by plague, because our conscience is dead when all that we are doing is thinking just about keeping ourselves safe. So the word pandemic, by now, I'm sure all of you know where it comes from, but I'll still repeat for those who don't. So pandemic, you all know, being students and teachers of literature, pan is all encompassing, demos, people. So something that affects a large section of people. Remember, there was this debate happening, why did WHO takes so much time to declare it as a pandemic. So there is it takes a certain number of people or number of countries to be affected before it can be called a pandemic. So pandemic basically is something which is pan, something which is universal, something which affects everyone, a lot of people. It's an epidemic of an infectious disease, which all of us now know, that has spread across a large region, for instance, multiple continents or worldwide, affecting a substantial number of people. And through human history, we've had a number of cases of the pandemics. So initially, there was smallpox and tuberculosis. In fact, I had done an article for The Wire where I talked about, the Shitala Mata, who was this goddess of smallpox. So when, people were affected, when there was no cure, when people didn't know how to deal with it, you worship the goddesses and try to cure yourself. So I had taken this whole, in fact, you can read it, it's there on the internet, how right from Shitala Mata to Corona Mata, even Corona Mata was worshipped. Corona was worshipped as a goddess in some places, because when people feel helpless, when people feel that they don't know how to sort of take care of themselves, then you are either praying or you are sort of, when you face mortality. See, what the pandemic did for us was that it brought our mortality very close to our eyes. All of us know we have to die, but all of us think, oh, we'll die. There is time. And suddenly, particularly during the second wave, it was like we could die any minute. It could be just happening to any of us. So, suddenly your mortality is very close to you, which results in, either you become very devout, or you become very philosophical, or you start writing your will, or so there are various ways that all of us cope with this kind of a situation. So, the most fatal pandemic in recorded history was the Black Death, also known as the plague, which I was talking about earlier, and I will discuss again, which killed an estimated 75 to 200 million people in the 14th century. And the other notable pandemics include the 1918 pandemic, the Spanish influenza or the Spanish flu, and till very recently, HIV/AIDS was looked at as a pandemic till there was a cure found for it. And then, of course, our good old COVID-19, which is still there. It's not quite gone away. So these are the noted pandemics that the world has seen. So now I take you really early to 430 to 420 BC, when Oedipus Rex was written by Sophocles. Many of you would have read the three very famous Theban plays, as they were called, of the Greek playwright Sophocles, Oedipus Rex, Oedipus at Colonus, and Antigone. These were the three plays. And in Delhi University, we actually study Oedipus Rex, or Oedipus the King, as it is called. So, interestingly, while researching Sophocles, I realized that what Sophocles is talking about, see, in the absence of what we now call or understand as medical science, there was, in the earlier days, when there would be a calamity, and even I can't even say earlier days, just now I was talking to you about Corona Mata, so it happens even today. So when there is a calamity, you first rush to the gods, asking the gods, how can we cure it? So if you remember, if you've read Oedipus Rex, which I think many of you would have, the very first scene has the people of Thebes complaining that there is a plague, a mysterious illness which is killing people. And Oedipus says, don't worry, I've already taken cognizance of it, and I have sent my brother-in-law Creon. Creon has gone to the to the oracle of Apollo to find out what has happened. So that is how the play begins. Right at the beginning, we are being told about this plague which has happened. So the very first scene of the play, Sophocles presents a basic social and historical axis around which the plot will be built. The devastating plague that dominates Thebes is presented to the audience through the dialogue between Oedipus and the priest. That is how we begin, lines 1 to 67. And the king has taken some action, like I told you. He sent Creon to the oracle of Delphi to ask for a salvation plan. And the oracle also announces that the plague is a result of religious pollution. So the word that is used is, it is a miasma, or it is a noxious pollution. Again, this particular word is of Greek origin, which means it's a moral, noxious pollution. So mark the words moral. So there's always this understanding that the plague, or any disease for that matter, any pandemic for that matter, happens because of a kind of a moral pollution, because the society has devolved in a certain way and has suffered in a certain way, which has resulted in a certain kind of noxious pollution. So if we were to ask ourselves, in the contemporary situation, what have we done really? Why are we talking about the noxious pollution? Well, there is so much. Look at the way we don't take care of the environment. Look at the way that we are so callous about the way we don't understand what is sustainable development. We are so callous about the environment. We are look at the pollution levels. So in every which way, wherever there is this noxious, which you can interpret it in any which way that you like, but that is from where the pandemic comes from. So Oedipus tells the citizens to stop praying and focusing on the cure. Now, this is also very interesting. As early as 430 to 420 BC, when Oedipus Rex was written, Oedipus remains the skeptic. he does not say he has sent his brother-in-law to the oracle of Delphi, but he tells his people that don't worry with the prayers, let's think of a cure. And we are told that people are burning incense sticks and animals are dying. So it is basically a kind of a disease which has affected the animals. So to take you further on this, I quote from the text. What means this reek of incense everywhere, and everywhere laments and litanies? So, like I was telling you, incense sticks have been put all over the place, and the priest says, "A blight is on our harvest in the year, a blight upon the grazing flocks and herds, a blight on wives in travail, and withal, armed with his blazing torch, the god of plague had swooped upon our city, emptying the house of Cadmus, and the murky realm of Pluto is full fed with groans and tears." So, what does this mean? That there is a kind of blight on our crops. Remember, this was an agrarian society. Our crops are dying, our sheep is dying, our herds are affected, and the way things are being affected, very soon the house of Cadmus is the house of the king. Oedipus and his father Laius before him. So very soon the house of Cadmus is going to be demolished because the city has been affected. And what else are we seeing here? That the entire city is fed with groans and tears. So people are crying. People are dying, crops are wilting away, the animals are dying. So it is a city which has become a city of despair. So if you just cast your minds back and if you look at the situation which had unfolded just a few months back, this is a very similar situation, that there is death and destruction everywhere. Everyone seems to be dying around you. It was, I think, one of the scariest phases of lives that all of us would have led in those months. So very, very reminiscent of what we were reading in Sophocles or the Sophoclean play. Now, interestingly, the Sophoclean play, so interestingly, the plague in Thebes is a historical epidemic. So there was a historian, Thucydides, who wrote about the plague. So the medical journals have actually talked about the epidemic, which was caused by what is called the Brucella abortus. So I'll read this a bit to make it make sense to you. So like I told you, Sophocles was one of the noted early playwrights of the ancient world who wrote the tragedy of Oedipus Rex, and these are his dates. A lethal plague is described in this drama. The medical researchers adopted a critical approach to Oedipus Rex in analyzing the literary description of the disease, unraveling its clinical features, and defining a possible underlying cause. The goals were to clarify whether the plague described in Oedipus Rex reflects an actual historical event, to compare it with the plague of Athens, which was described by Thucydides as occurring around the same time. So remember the early the debate between, say, Plato and Aristotle, as it had happened those many years back, when Plato had said that literature is sort of, it reflects life. So it is a mirror to life, and Aristotle had argued that this mirror to life, or this this reflection of life, was actually very real. So whatever was being seen in real life was being mirrored. It's a mimetic view. The term that we use is the mimetic view. The plague had actually happened, animals had died, and Thucydides had actually written down about it and mentioned it in his historical journal. And the medical journals refer as far back and take this example that this is what had happened. So why am I starting with Sophocles? I'm starting with Sophocles to tell you that plague, this kind of a miasma, this kind of the horrors that the world has been seeing is a recurrent event. It's not a one-off event. And another reason why I say it is when it happened to us, when we faced the pandemic for the first time, we behaved like it was happening for the first time to humankind. There didn't seem to be any reference point. We didn't seem to understand what had gone on. So, which is why I keep emphasizing that the knowledge of history and the knowledge of literature could have sort of enabled us with a certain kind of an understanding. But unfortunately, we are very quick to forget our history, and we don't take literature seriously enough to understand that literature is a mimetic reflection of the world. So we should have taken them seriously, which we didn't. So it hit us like a bombshell, and we were like I said, running like headless chicken, because we didn't know how to deal with this kind of a magnitude of mass deaths which were suddenly staring us in the eye. So that is where your medical sciences, that is where your epidemiologists, that is where the scientific temperament and coupled with the historical understanding could have saved us. So I again quote a little from Oedipus Rex. Wasted thus by death on death by our city perishes, corpses spread infection round. And then the plague that is described in Oedipus Rex could possibly be related to the plague that struck Athens. So this is a historical event between 430 to 429 BC, and the primary source being the historian who I've talked about. And then the exact similar things happen is that blaming of the god of war. So blaming Ares, the god of war, and appeals to the citizens to propitiate the god for freeing them from plague and pestilence. So always when there is crisis, you have to, this is human nature. Basic human nature is you rush to the gods. Interestingly, Ares is the god of war. So the whole pandemic situation is more than often it is likened to a war. It's like it's a war against mankind. So then you feel that the gods have waged a war against mankind. The gods need to be propitiated, and then there is going to be peace on earth once again. And interestingly, look at the timeline. We were talking about 430 to 429 BC, and then here we were talking about the 21st century, where again we were doing pretty much the same things. If you heard the way the pandemic was being talked about, it was very definitely a war against a war against the people, and the way it was being countered was exactly like how one would counter a war. So the war metaphors held, and the exact same things were again being repeated, so to say, in the 21st century. So this is Sophocles. I just wanted to show you a picture of his. Okay, so now I'm going to make this huge jump and come to the 16th century and talk about Shakespeare. The reason why I talk about Shakespeare, because if you remember, during the pandemic, there was this WhatsApp messages which went around, which told people that you are doing nothing, but Shakespeare wrote 3 plays during the plague years, or Shakespeare was writing so much during the plague years. Well, he was writing. I wanted to and even the names of the plays were mentioned, and it was kind of, suddenly Shakespeare seemed to be people were talking about Shakespeare as the great plague writer, so to say. Well, to demythicize that, Shakespeare lived his entire life through the plague years. And his right from his birth till his entire career. There isn't too much known about Shakespeare, as you all know, but he lived through the entire, period of the plague, so to say, and he was severely affected. So the house in which he was born, that got declared as one of the plague houses, and the landlord died. And then the Globe Theatre was shut down for months on end because of the plague situation. So a lot of so he lived his entire life, so to say, in the shadow of the plague. But interestingly, Shakespeare does not write about the plague. So Shakespeare kind of did not actually deal with the realities of his situation. He liked to create something which was fantastic, something which he could base in another part of Europe and not talk about England at all. So interestingly, for somebody who lives his entire life in the shadow of the plague, who suffers financially because the theaters had shut down, who lost friends, who lost people close to him, but did not quite want to talk about the plague per se. So I had this picture to show you. This is one of the depictions of the plague. Just look at, and if you see this picture closely, it will remind you of one of the pictures we had seen of the migrant workers when they had, when they had walked back. The mother had fallen dead, and the child was still suckling. So, this was a painting which was made years, centuries before, and we actually saw a graphic situation where, due to the pandemic, when the migrant workers were forced to leave, we actually had this visual of a mother falling dead and a child suckling at her breast. So this is your typical pandemic situation where people drop dead like flies, and it is so contagious that people try to avoid each other, but that's not always possible. So pretty much I will repeat what I have just said. So he lived his entire life in the shadow of the bubonic plague. This was what it was called. So April 26, 1564, in the parish register of Holy Trinity Church in Stratford upon Avon, the vicar recorded the baptism of Guilliamus Filius Johannes Shakespeare. So born on this particular date. A few months later, in the very same register, the vicar noted the death of Oliver Gunn, an apprentice weaver, and in the margins next to that entry scribbled the word, I don't read Latin, so my pronunciation will be all wrong, but in English it would be, "Here begins the plague." So in that same register, remember those days were not days of the internet, we didn't have Google, then in the 16th century, to have kept all the documentation, but the British were always very meticulous about documentation. So there is a birth entry of a child in 1564, and in that same register, a little below, we are told that there is a man called Oliver Gunn who dies. He's a weaver, and then it is scribbled towards the close of that register that the plague starts now. So, and we know that bubonic plague was one of the most severe plagues that happened in London, and a huge number of people were killed because of the bubonic plague. Luckily, Shakespeare and his family were spared, and they did not die of the plague. But like I said, right from his birth till his entire life, so to say, he lived under the shadow of the plague. So the good part about the plague, if there can be anything good, is that the outbreaks don't rage on forever. So there will be this lull, like now, it's a lull period, and then it starts all over again. So they don't rage on forever. And how is it prevented? Now, I'll read from my notes here. With the help of strict quarantines and a change in the weather, the epidemic would slowly wane. So the same concept of quarantine and and the change of weather. Remember, it was being said that when the weather becomes a little warmer, things might be better, and quarantine. So right from the very moment when the concept of plague came to the world, so to say, and people started to grapple with it, it was understood as early as that the only way to keep safe was by organizing quarantine stay, because the epidemic spread so fast that it was important that one could quarantine. And the exact same things that were done when the pandemic hit us was that we were told to quarantine, we were told to stay at home, we were told not to go out, we were told not to meet people, and so on and so forth. The exact same things were done in the 16th century. Okay, so strict quarantines and eventually a change of weather. The epidemic would slowly wane, as it did in Stratford, and life would resume its normal course. But in the interval of a few years, in cities and towns throughout the realm, the plague would return. And it generally appeared on the scene with no warning. And it was terrifyingly contagious. So victims would awaken, and look at this again, the symptoms: fever and chills, a feeling of extreme weakness and exhaustion, would give rise to diarrhea, vomiting, bleeding from the mouth, nose, or rectum, and the telltale buboes. The reason why it was called bubonic plague was because of the swollen lymph nodes that would appear in the groin or the armpit. And the death would often be in great agony, and eventually, once the person got those terrible buboes, the person, it was like the death sentence had been written and the person would die. So effectively, it was something which was extremely traumatic. So first, a person comes down with the fever and the chills. Then the person has to be quarantined. Within the quarantine, if the person develops a bubo or a swollen lymph node, the person dies. And it would recur after a few years. So it wasn't something that happened at one go and disappeared. It kept coming back in one form or the other. So it was another thing that you see. It was recognized that the rate of infection was far higher in densely populated cities than in the countryside. Those with means to do so escaped to the rural retreats, though they often brought the infection with them. Now, this is something that you will absolutely identify with, that the infection was actually much higher within the cities, and the villages eventually became infected when the people from the cities were forced to go to the villages, or they were sent to the villages. Then they carried with them the infection, but still overall the villages remained somewhat safer as compared to the cities, where it was way more rampant, where it was happening pretty much in every household and bringing with it death and destruction. So when the deaths surpassed 30 in numbers, so this is what they did, and this is 16th century I'm talking about. If I didn't tell you that I'm talking about the 16th century, you would think that I'm sharing with you some trivia which would have happened in the present times. So when the deaths surpassed about 30 people, they banned assemblies, feasts, archery contests, and other forms of mass gathering, since it was believed that it was impossible to become infected during the act of worship. The church services were not included in the ban, though the infected were not permitted to attend. But the public theatres in London, which routinely brought together 2,000 or 3,000 people in an enclosed space, were ordered shut. It would take many months before the death rate came down sufficiently for the authorities to allow the theatres to reopen. So mass gatherings were stopped, no social gatherings were allowed. Only the church visits were not stopped, because there was this feeling that God will not punish people for visiting, God in the churches. But then every other space which would see any kind of gathering, it was stopped. And the worst, because Shakespeare personally was affected, his people would perform. Initially, it was the chamberlain's men, and then it was the king's men who performed the Shakespearean plays. But for months together, the theater houses would remain shut, and then finally they would reopen once the plague had sort of subsided somewhat. So this continued to happen. So it was a recurrent event. So all kind of spaces which would see a mass gathering, they had to be willy-nilly shut down. Okay. So in 1606, deaths from the plague led to the closure of theatres. The disease reached the playwright's house in London and was to change his professional life and the whole of drama forever. And yet, interestingly, Shakespeare does not engage with the plague the way he should have. None of his characters in the in his pantheon of the brilliant plays that he has written, none of them die of plague. He doesn't mention in any of the plagues that the theater shut down. There's only one description among many, and but those were very brief, and it's like a blink and you miss it kind of a mention, where King Lear provided an apt description of the plague's ghastly symptoms by way of King's insult to his daughter. And he insults his daughter by saying, "Thou art a boil, a plague sore, and embossed carbuncle in my corrupted blood." So that's what was seen. That's what plague was looked at. That it was a sore, it was a boil, it was a carbuncle. Is like it's again a boil which has gone, which has sort of happened because of corrupted blood, which means bad blood. And interestingly, though Shakespeare does not talk about it as much as one would have expected him to, because he lived his entire life grappling with the plague in so many manners. Another very famous playwright, Ben Jonson, in his play The Alchemist, he talks about the house being vacant during the plague. So Alchemist begins with the master of the house having left the house and gone to the countryside to escape the plague, and the servant takes over the house, and then the whole play is based on how the servant pretends to be the master and all kinds of things that he does. So you do have the mention of the plague, which is recurrent, but again, Johnson also leaves it in those first two lines. It doesn't go any beyond that, because then the rest of the plot of the play is somewhat different. But there is a very definite mention of the word plague and how people had run away from the city, from the London city to that of the countryside. Okay. So I wanted to also share with you Thomas Nash's very, very popular poem called A Litany in the Time of Plague. And the reason for sharing this with you is also because it kind of tells us everything that we learned. We thought we were learning for the first time, but like I keep saying, it has been in record. It's just that we did not understand it. We did not read it in the context that we should have read it. I read out this poem to you. Rich men, trust not in wealth. Gold cannot buy you health. Physic himself must fade. All things to end are made. The plague full swift goes by. I am sick and I must die. Lord, have mercy on us. Beauty is but a flower, which wrinkles will devour. Brightness falls from the air. Queens have died, young and fair. Dust hath closed Helen's eye. I am sick, I must die. Lord, have mercy on us. So this was written in the summer of 1592. We are still in the 16th century. I'm talking about Shakespeare and his contemporaries. And what do we learn from this poem? We learn from this poem is that don't be proud. Don't think that because you're rich, you will be able to avoid death, because death does not see. Death does not discriminate between the rich and the poor. Death does not discriminate between somebody who's highborn and somebody who's lowborn. A plague does not discriminate, it just kills. And this is something that we all learned firsthand, that whether you were a minister, whether you were a rich person, whether you were the who's who of the society, when the pandemic hit And when the hospitals were full, and when there was no place, when there was no oxygen, everybody was running from pillar to post. And death did not spare anybody. So we lost so many people from so many different walks of life. So this Thomas Nash's poem tells us that the queen will also die, beauty will wilt. You could be the most beautiful person, but if the plague has you, it will wilt. And probably the only person who could save you, if at all, would be God and not the gold, because all the pride that you have in your gold is eventually going to come to naught, because gold will not be able to save you. Now we come to the Journal of the Plague. This was in 1722. So I've jumped a bit from the 16th century. Now I'm in 1722. Now, Daniel Defoe, who you all know for being one of the most brilliant writers, his Robinson Crusoe, all of you would have read, and Defoe was one of the most prolific writers of his time. He wrote so many pamphlets, and of course, he wrote brilliant novels. So Daniel Defoe did not exactly experience the plague himself, but thought, he was a great one, very, very typical of his character, his protagonist, Robinson Crusoe. Defoe believed in chronicling things. So he actually thought that he will chronicle for the future generation what had happened during the plague years, because he wanted people to understand that this happens, the world is going to face it, it is going to keep coming back. Whatever you might have achieved scientifically or medically, because the world is changing constantly, you will have to face, plagues, pandemics in some form or the other. So have a scientific temperament, deal with it sensibly, you will manage. You don't have a scientific temperament, you don't understand what has happened to you, you're going to succumb to plague. So he actually wrote down a journal called the Journal of the Plague Year. So it is an account of a man's experience of the year 1665, in which the bubonic plague struck the city of London in what became known as the Great Plague of London, the last epidemic of the plague of that city. So the book is told somewhat chronologically, though with sections or chapter headings and with frequent digressions and repetitions. So what Daniel Defoe does is that, he had really not experienced the plague per se, but he reconstructs the events, and he talks to the masses, and he writes down everything, because he feels that it is important that the next generation or people coming after me should know that such a thing had happened. So he writes about it at all given points of time. And then he also does something. He talks about the media. Now, this is very interesting, that he should mention the media, because he said that in a way it is good that we didn't have. So he writes, and I quote, "We had no such thing as printed newspapers in those days to spread rumors and reports of things, and to improve them by the invention of men, as I have lived to see practiced since." So Defoe is very critical of the media that is there, and he. Sorry, I seem to have lost. Yeah, okay. Are you able to see my presentation?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Yeah, because I thought I lost it. So Defoe says he was eminently critical of the media per se. And he says, well, thank goodness for the fact that the media was not as active as it was in the later years, because effectively then it would have spread a lot of fake news. So because in the absence of the printed newspapers, at least the rumors did not get spread. And then he also delineates his reason for writing. So the reason for writing the novel was didactic. He was preaching something. So he says, I have set this particular down so fully, the narrator states, and I quote, because I know not, but it may be a moment to those who come after me, if they come to be brought to the same distress. So, very categorically, he's saying that if there are the plague, in some form or the other, the journal that I'm leaving behind will guide them. That is the reason why I'm writing. So typical of Defoe, he was didactic, he was teaching people, and he says that is the reason why I have set down this particular so very fully. He adds, so the journal basically aims to lay out a blueprint that future societies can follow if they are ever confronted with the disasters that the people at that point of time had felt. So he writes down in very graphic explanatory terms as to how on earth to deal with plague or a pandemic if it were to hit any society. So I quote from the text, it must be confessed that though the plague was chiefly among the poor, yet were the poor the most venturous and fearless of it, and went about their employment with a sort of brutal courage. I must call it so, for it was founded neither on religion or prudence. Scarce did they use any caution, but run into business which they could get employment in, though it was the most hazardous. Such was that of tending to the sick, watching houses shut up, carrying infected persons to the pest house, and which was still worse, carrying the dead away to the graves. So he says, I must credit the poor people, though they suffered so much, but they were there to take care. They were there to take care of the people when they fell ill. There was a lot of heart which the poor people were capable of displaying, while the rich they either ran away to the countryside houses, the rich barricaded themselves and refused to engage with the poor. And this is something that I think is so reminiscent of pretty much the kind of things that we did. You know, those of us who lived in these gated communities, the gates were shut down on the helps. They were not allowed to enter. More often than not, people did not give them their salaries. And yet, according to Daniel Defoe, it is these people who went about helping. They carried the dead bodies, knowing fully well that you could be infected. They took care of the sick, and then they also oversaw the people, as they were buried. So they managed to do all these tasks, knowing fully well that this was hazardous to their own health. And then I also quote another very interesting line. Wherever God erects a house of prayer, the devil always builds a chapel there, and it will be found upon examination. The latter has the largest congregation. This is also quite funny, that wherever you have a temple or wherever you have a church, wherever the God builds his house of power, the devil also builds something bang next door, and the devil seems to have more followers than God. The devil's congregation is always higher than that of the gods. So this was Defoe in all his jest, in his tongue-in-cheek humor. But basically, what he's trying to tell us, he's telling us that by having a certain kind of scientific temperament, by maintaining confinement situations, by learning to sort of stay separately from each other if you are affected, and having the heart also to take care of each other in times of need, is the only way you can come out of the plague situation. People have to stand by each other. People have to be segregated and separated, yes, but then there is also need for people to come together in this cause, because this is a war. The war is against the people, so people also need to come together. Okay. So Now I bring a bit of Foucauldian theory here, because Foucault impacted upon Defoe much later, of course. So you can see that I have now skipped the time frame, and I'm talking about, I'm in the 20th century now. So Foucault talks about the three dreams of plague. And the two that I found particularly very impressive. One is the literary dream. So, what, according to Foucault, is the literary dream? So, there is the literature of plague. Foucault states in his lecture, um, that is a literature of the decomposition of individuality, a kind of orgiastic dream in which plague is the moment when individuals come apart, when the law is forgotten. So, he says the literary dream, it kind of it elevates people, and it loosens up a certain kind of social and moral code, the codes that were there within the society. Because when mortality, when death is staring you in the eye, you can think a little beyond the moral codes that have been holding you together. When I talk about the moral codes, he's not asking people to be immoral, but basically what he's saying is that the literary dream is about people coming together. See, there are two things that can happen when there is a time of crisis. Either people bond and they come together, even if not physically but mentally, or people fight, bicker with each other. So he says the literary dream is always about people coming together. They come together with a sense of purpose. They come together to help. They come together in order, because at that point of time, the laws of the land are somewhat forgotten, because there's a greater chaos and a greater devil which needs to be fought. So that is your literary dream. That is the social dream. I will call it the social dream. So the society, more often than not, it reacts to this situation by bonding, by having a shared purpose. You look at these students who are working towards coming back. So they and so many interviews I was seeing of these very bright and brave young students who said, we formed our own groups, we understood that there was a problem, and we decided to work it out like this, and they successfully did it. So in times of crisis, strangers bond, come together with a sense of a common purpose, and they achieve that common purpose. The political dream during a plague situation is absolutely different, because the political dream then becomes to appropriate and abrogate as much power as you can, because the people are scared. This is the best time for the state to take over, for the state to say that you all don't know how to take care of yourselves. So we have come in. The state is more powerful than the people. The state will decide and rule over the people. So the societal dream is different. The political dream is different. Is Defoe's analysis of the plague situation, and he is Foucault's analysis of the plague situation, and Foucault is impacting upon Defoe's work, saying that there are always going to be these two faces. There will always be the society, the civil society, and we saw how this worked in the pandemic situation that unfolded before us. It is the civil society which joined hands and started helping each other. The cries for help that were being circulated on Twitter, unknown people helping each other, people coming together via social media, via all kinds of things, and people were bonding. There were langars being organized. People who didn't know each other were sending food to each other. If a whole house came down with with the pandemic, then some neighbor, some person from somewhere would suddenly take it upon themselves to supply food. So the civil society landed up bonding. The political class, of course, the political dream is different. The political dream of any pandemic situation or any war-like situation is always abrogation of power. So you have the diversity of the society thinking in a certain way, and the political political entities thinking differently. So the plague, according to the political dream, and I quote Foucault here, is the marvelous moment when the political power is exercised to the full. Plague is the moment when spatial partitioning and subdivision of the population is taken to its extreme point, where dangerous communications, disorderly communities, and forbidden contacts can no longer appear. The moment of the plague is one of the exhaustive sectioning of the population by political power, the capillary ramifications of which constantly reach the grain of individuals themselves, their time, their habitat, the localization, and bodies. So, what Foucault is basically saying is that the political dream is, this kind of a situation is the perfect political dream of abrogation of power, because this is the time when segregation can happen according to class, according to caste, according to minorities that can be treated in a certain manner. Everybody can be put in their boxes because the disease demands that you are separated. And if you look at, I don't want to talk a lot about this, but if you think about it yourselves, you will understand exactly what I'm talking about, how this sectioning was done within the social structures. And this, how this sectioning was done with the help of the media, how this sectioning was done, and whenever there is any kind of sectioning done, obviously the people who suffer are the minorities. And how the minorities are targeted when this kind of a sectioning is done by the political class. So I don't want to give you any examples. I want you to think through. I'm sure there will be lots of examples that you will find for yourselves. Okay. So what Foucault says, and I'm quoting Foucault again. Give me a minute. So now he's talking about the civil society. He's talking about the literary, he calls it literary society. I call it the civil society. He says, and I quote, a whole literary fiction of the festival grew up around the plague. Suspended laws, lifted prohibitions, the frenzy of passing time, bodies mingling together without respect. But there was also a political dream of the plague, which was exactly the reverse. Not the collective festival, but strict division. Not laws transgressed, but the penetration of regulation into even the smallest details of everyday life. See, when the state gains or abrogates a certain kind of power, the state literally can also peek into every room, telling people how they need to behave or what they need to do. So while the civil society would want to come out together as a holistic unit which can be celebratory or can be just coming together for helping each other, the political class will always behave in a different manner. And Foucault talks about it in his whole discourse on power and how the power plays on the pandemic's work. You have to understand that there is always a politics attached to everything, our everyday lives. So Foucault, analyzes the text, the Journal of the Plague, and he talks about the whole concept of the power equations as they exist in the society. Okay, I want to show you a painting which was made by Bruegel in 1562, and I'm going to enlarge it for a bit so that all of you can see it. Now just look, in this painting, everyone has fallen dead. So, and then you have this, you can see this here. It's a skeleton which is sitting on a horse cart, and it's taking dead bodies. Men, women, everyone seems to have died, and while doing their everyday tasks. And it's a very scary, it's a very scary picture that we see, because these are familiar pictures. When we would see the way the people were dying, the way the the places for cremation and the places for burial, they were overflowing, how dead bodies had to be abandoned, or they were thrown into the river, or all kinds of things that happened. And you see, this is so reminiscent, and this is not a recent picture. This is a picture of 1562. And I'm sure if you juxtapose this with a picture of the recent times, it would be pretty much the same picture that we were seeing on our television screens or on our computer screens. How many people were dying, how they could not be cremated, or there were queues, or there was mass cremation, all kinds of horrific things that were happening. We even heard that some parks had to be converted into crematoria because there were not enough spaces. So and you look at this picture, it's such a traumatic and such a terrifying picture, and this was in 1562. Okay, so now I move to a more contemporary text. I've moved from you know from 17 what was the date that we had of Defoe, 17 something, to now Mary Shelley's The Last Man, which was written in 1826. So now we've moved to the 19th century. So The Last Man is a very interesting text which Mary Shelley wrote. Unfortunately, we don't read that text very much. We read George Orwell's 1984 or Huxley's Brave New World, but somehow Mary Shelley's text has not become that popular unless some of you have read it. So it's an apocalyptic dystopian science fiction novel, and it was published in 1826. And the book describes a future Earth, which it calls, so the book had been written in 1826, and it describes a future Earth around the late 21st century, which is ravaged by an unknown pandemic which sweeps across the world. And it includes a discussion of the English culture as a republic, with Mary Shelley sitting in the meetings of the House of Commons, gaining an insight into the governmental political system in the Romantic era. So this story is about the pandemic, which, it's an imaginative story. It's a science fiction. It's an apocalyptic dystopian science fiction, where it is said that this is happening. This death, destruction, and calamity is happening in the 21st century. So The Last Man is the first piece, so to say, of the dystopic novel which was ever published. But sadly, it wasn't read as much as, like I said, George Orwell's 84 or Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. So because it does not talk about the political theme of repression and totalitarianism, so it remains at the realm of something which is fantastic, something where the pandemic has hit the 21st century. However, a lot of work is now happening, now that there is a lot of work on sci-fi fiction. So literally, the godmother, if one could put it, would be someone like Mary Shelley. Okay. So now, also on a similar sort of timeline, I would talk about an American writer who, again, extremely famous, Edgar Allan Poe. He published in 1842, and the story is also very interesting, about Prince Prospero. And this Prince Prospero is trying to avoid a dangerous plague, and the plague is called Red Death. Sorry. So he's hiding in the abbey. He's hiding in all kinds of places. And what the king has done is that he has organized a mask, a ball, where people are having a masquerade ball, and all of them are celebrating, but they are cut off from the common masses. And because of their how much money they have and how rich they are, there is this belief that death can't touch them. So and then the Red Death, however, enters this masquerade and finds Prospero and manages to kill him, and then manages to kill the guests who had come as well. So it's like a everybody is eliminated. So this particular disease could have been inspired by tuberculosis, or it was called consumption in those days. And Poe's wife Virginia was herself suffering from this disease when this story was written. And Poe's mother Eliza, brother William, and foster mother Frances had also died of tuberculosis. So alternative, the Red Death might have been cholera, because Poe himself had the epidemic of cholera in Maryland in 1831. So it could have been anything. But what is interesting is, again, this belief that the rich have, that because of their money and because of their privileges, they can avoid death. But death defeats them by dressing up as one of the masqueraders and by catching up with them and killing the man. And then there is this picture that I want you to see. Now, look at this. Here is death standing over the man who had tried to run away from death. And death is all fearful with blood dripping, and the man is lying prostrate before death. So the chilling reminder that you can be rich, you can be powerful, you can have a lot of money, you can be the who's who of you can be who's who of the glitterati, you can be whoever, but if and when death catches up with you, you cannot run away. And this story is a chilling reminder of that. Has my are you still able to see my screen? Okay, I'll
Yes, ma'am.
this message saying you're not presenting. Okay, so now I shift very briefly. I haven't dealt a lot with this, but very briefly to two writers who you all will be absolutely familiar with. One, of course, is Tagore, our Nobel laureate, and the other one I will talk about is Suryakant Tripathi Nirala. Tagore does not per se talk about the pandemic, but he has this very beautiful poem called Puratun Bhrito, which means the old slave. And then in this particular poem, he talks about how the old slave takes care of his master when the master comes down with plague, and eventually the slave dies and the master becomes all right. And again, this was Tagore's way of, he's echoing pretty much the same thoughts that again Foucault talks about. So this whole concept that very often it is the underprivileged, it is the poor, it is people who do not have enough, but they are more compassionate, they are more sincere, unlike the privileged people. In this particular poem, and I will read only the translation. It's a very beautiful poem about this servant who was an old servant, and he used to get on everyone's nerves. Nobody liked him, and the master used to tell him every day, "Go away! I don't want to see your face. You're an ugly man. I don't want to see you." But he does not leave his master, and then they go on a trip. Excuse me, together, and the master falls ill. The servant takes care, and then the master becomes well, and the servant dies. So I will just quote from the translation of the poem. Goblinesque of appearance, he was a fool beyond measure. Anything went missing, screamed the mistress, Keshto stole our treasure. So this is something which all of you will understand. Anything goes missing from the house, immediately the servants are the suspects. From dawn till dusk, I swore on his father's name, barely any heed he paid. The caning exceeded his earnings, yet witless was he, of such stuff he was made. So from day in and day out, he was insulted, taking his father's name. It's a way people are insulted. The swear words, and he would be caned at the drop of a hat, and yet he did not leave, and he just stayed on. And then it's a long poem. I will not read it. It's a very very popular poem. Many people recite it in recitation competitions. And this I'm reading the almost last stanza. Before long, regaining my health, as I was up and about, the fever set upon him. My life giver appropriated my fatal disease as each day his prospects grew dim. Losing consciousness, he lay there for a day or two until no pulse was in him left. For so long had I tried to be rid of him, and at long last of him I was bereft. So the master saying that I wanted to get rid of him throughout, but interestingly, he stayed on. Every day we would ask him to go away, but he stayed on. He nursed me back to health. They had gone on a trip together. The master fell ill. The slave nursed him back to health, but then the slave fell ill, and after a brief illness, so and at this point of time the master understands and calls him his life giver, but by that time the life giver has lost consciousness and he has gone. And then briefly, I will talk about Suryakant Tripathi Nirala. Nirala lost, he wrote in his memoir in Hindi, the translation is A Life Misspent. And he lost many family members, including his wife and a little daughter. I just quote I will just quote Nirala and tell me if you cannot see the exact thing that had happened in very recent times in India and in all parts of the world. So I traveled to the riverbank in Dalamau and waited. The Ganga was swollen with dead bodies. At my in law's house, I learned that my wife had passed away. Many other members of Nirala's family also died. My family disappeared in the blink of an eye. All our sharecroppers and laborers died. The four who worked for my cousin, they also died. My younger daughter was just a year old. In whichever direction I turned, I saw darkness. These deaths were they were not a coincidence or personal tragedies. They were connected to the Spanish influenza or Black Death or Kalazar, as it was called. And these lines, mark you, were written in 1918. In 1918, the Ganga was swollen with dead bodies, and we had a very similar, the Lash Vahini Ganga, as the poetic rendition went, and we saw all those horrific pictures. So a repeat situation, but we were caught unawares because we had forgotten our history. Now I'm nearing the end. So same timeline, same date line. Eliot is talking about the wasteland. You all know the poem, so I will just read the first 2 or 3 lines. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots and spring rain, and so on and so forth. So the land has become a wasteland. In 1918, humanity was not just staggering out of the horrors of the World War when she was hit with the Spanish flu. So look at the situation. Here we had the pandemic and there's a war happening. 1918, similar. By 1920, 500 million people had been infected and 50 million dead. And the pandemic of 2020 have given us pretty much similar doses of reality. And we had not emerged from the hellish world war. Instead, we were living in a Disneyland bubble of affluence and technological marvels. See, before the pandemic hit us, we were living in a kind of a technological bubble that, oh, our medical facility is great, our scientific understanding is stellar, nothing can happen to us. And then you saw what happened. And I will now quote from Yeats. The lines are again so similar. And I will show you something different from either your shadow at morning striding before you, or your shadow at the evening rising to meet you. Under the brown fog of winter dawn, a crowd flowed over London Bridge, so many. I had not thought death had undone so many. So, this whole concept of death, so many people dying, death, these were recurrent metaphors of both T.S. Eliot and Yeats. They were impacting both on the disease and the world wars which they were facing. And then you have W.B. Yeats's Second Coming, again, a poem that all of you are familiar with. Yeats himself had suffered from the pandemic. Yeats watched helplessly as his pregnant wife struggled to fight off the virus in their rented house in Dublin, and she died. Before it was over, the flu had infected about 600,000 to 800,000 people in Ireland and killed far more than were lost in the internal political violence, which was also consuming the country. So, death and war, uh, pandemic and war together, the biggest uh, killers. So, what do we learn? We learn what have the people sensitized us to, what has literature sensitized us to. It's the criticism of avariciousness, of greed, that human beings are so greedy, but in times of calamity, your money can't save you. Then rushing to the city for more money, leaving, effectively the equilibrium of places is lost. A sense of callousness towards each other. Fear of contracting the disease brings out a great deal of selfishness, as we saw throughout the pandemic times. There were people who rose above the selfishness. They were heroic, but 99% of the people, most of us, we stayed home, we huddled, we were just concerned that my family should be safe and I should be safe. And then there was plea for empathy and humanitarian values. The poets, the literateurs were all talking about this, that what we need in this world, whether during war, whether during the pandemic, is empathy, is humanitarian values, and most importantly, a plea for respecting nature, because unless and until nature is respected, nature is going to kill us. So, absolutely important that such a thing happens. And I end with the very famous lines from Yeats's poem: surely some revelation is at hand, surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming, hardly are those words out, when the vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight somewhere in the sands of desert. And I will not read this, but there was this, I'll end with this painting of William Blake, which shows the humankind in its kind of brutal shape, that the human being, part animal, part human, the shape as it has been painted by Blake. So I think I'll stop here now. It's fairly late. I don't know if I overshot my time, and I hope you all have questions. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
So it is often we often heard that literature is the reflection of life, and when we go through the textbook, books like Oedipus and the King, and we never thought that once we also go through that situation, and
Yeah.
unfortunately we are in that situation, and so thank you, ma'am, for in this pandemic period, for giving such a panoramic view regarding the pandemic seen through the literary lens. Thank you, ma'am. Now it's time. A special thanks to Betsy, ma'am, for having you for this session. Thank you, Betsy, ma'am, too. And now it's the time for question and session. Participants, if any queries, please ask.
Uh, Thank you, Lena. Thank you, Angela. Thanks for the kind comments. You can also share your comments. I'm very happy with that, even if there are no questions.
You can either ask or post your questions here in the chat box. Susan ma'am, okay.
Nandini ma'am,
Thank you.
it was quite interesting to listen to you. Your narration was really effective. I was really absorbed in what you were saying. You very methodically and effectively gave us a history of the pandemic, how it is represented in literature over many years. Now, I was actually curious to ask you a question because I know that you are a writer, you have written short stories, and you have specifically written about women as well. So I was curious to know, ma'am, whether you have written any story on a pandemic and how women have dealt with this pandemic. Since you are a story writer and a very creative person, rather than referring to all these writers who have recorded pandemic in their works, I felt I should ask you how you have recorded or how you are trying to make use of story as a tool to make sense of illness and coping mechanisms. I would be happy to get the answer from a writer's pen.
Thank you so much, Susan. And that's a very valid question. I love.
Dr. Nandini, Susan herself is a writer. She
Oh,
has
Susan,
published two books,
I
one
would love to
collection of
read your works, and yeah,
poems and
I think I should have guessed that from the question that you asked. This particular volume, and let me show my latest book because currently we are promoting this book. So,
Nandini ma'am, Betsy Miss shared it. So I went through the blurb and I was actually anxiously waiting to see you on screen.
thank you. Um, you all can let me know if some of you want signed copies so I can sign it and post it. So now I've got enough copies sitting with me. I managed to do that. So that is something I could do. Otherwise, of course, there's Amazon for picking up books. Okay, so to answer your question, Susan, I think, not in this volume, because this volume was pre-pandemic. It got delayed because of the pandemic. So this volume doesn't have the pandemic, but subsequently I have written about it. I have written about, without giving too much away, but about this woman who is married and to a man who doesn't appreciate her very much, and then a man who's okay with her, not that he hates her or anything, but doesn't quite appreciate the skills that she has, and then the man loses his job due to the pandemic, and then what happens within the domestic situation. So I have written about that, but that's not in this volume. That's already been printed, but someplace else. So I could share the story. But yeah, so I would deal with it. I do see the pandemic having upended so many things. People lost their jobs, people lost their livelihoods, and women. Since I talk about women a lot, women always rise up to the occasion. So whenever there is a crisis situation, it's never the man, it's always the woman who takes it upon herself and is able to move forward. So yeah, so I think I should write more, but this was the one story that I could immediately think about. And interestingly, I mean, to give a little bit of a spoiler, this person, she can go back to what she loved doing because there was this domestic crisis. So yeah, I don't know.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Nandini ma'am, for sharing that. Thank you.
Good evening, Nandini ma'am.
Hi.
Ma'am, this is Kartika ma'am. I would like to ask your opinion or rather suggestion that you mentioned about Shakespeare, and you said that Shakespeare only just mentioned the plague in Lear, just only a particular sentence or just a word was mentioned. What do you think? Since all these write-ups will get into the history, do you think while writers write on a pandemic context, whether they should concentrate more on it because later the literature becomes a part of history? So whether they should just give a mention, or what is your opinion? They should write more on it so that people who read will come to know about it.
Kartika, that's a tough one. I'll tell you why that's a tough one. Because, there is no set guidelines. we don't operate, the writers don't operate with any kind of a guideline. So Shakespeare, like we all know, he kind of tried to keep things away from the realist mode. So all his plays would be enacted either in Venice or in uh, in the forest somewhere, or somewhere in Italy, in Rome. It was never England. Even when he was stark, real, talking about the English king, queen, he tried to create that difference because it was important. If he talked directly, there could always be political repercussions. So things don't change. History keeps repeating itself. So, but yes, writing about the pandemic, I think, is important because what Defoe did, he did try to sensitize people, to tell them that, okay, this is something that will keep happening and this is what you need to do. So, yeah, it is important to talk about it. It's not right that we allow ourselves and the subsequent generations to forget that something so traumatic and tragic can happen to you. It's like, you look at our generation. I mean, we have grown up hearing about the wars earlier. The 65 war, the 71 war, because none of us knew it. We were not there that time. It never affected us. It didn't make any sense to us. I have heard these stories that there used to be these lights going off and this and that, but it seemed like a fairy tale. It didn't seem like real, and today it's actually happening. Similarly, pandemic was happening elsewhere to everybody else. It couldn't happen to you. I mean, how many times one has read Puratun Britto, but who ever thought? How many times one has read Nirala? But those were stories. When it hits you, then it really hits you. So yeah, writing about it is important. Writing about it, also it's catharsis for your own soul. Um, you What all we have faced, if we do not write it down, how will we also remember it? Forget about the next generation. We'll forget it after some time. So I personally feel talking about it and writing about it is very, very important.
Thank you, ma'am. I was coming to ask whether you'll be taking the stand of Shakespeare or differ when you write something.
I mean, I don't measure up even to his little toenail, but but yeah, one I think should write about it, and you don't have to be a creative writer to write about it. You write about it in whichever uh, these days. The people who are blogging, there's so many avenues which are there, and if we, the students and teachers of English, don't express ourselves, then who will? We have the language, so we should be writing. And thank you, all of you who are putting in these very kind comments on the chat box. Thank you so much, all of you.
Any further questions?
Ma'am, I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
Do the writers writing about pandemic literature set around the pandemic time, can they sort of address the issues of race, class, and ableism, issues like that? Are they sort of pointing that when we are in the midst of a pandemic, such social divisions are kind of irrelevant, since this is something which is affecting all, irrespective of caste, class, and creed? So, can the pandemic literature, is it sending a kind of message that this is kind of unifying people because of the situation we are in? And you also talked about Foucault, that he did say that it can bring people together, but also it can also create differences. So, what is your view on that?
Aarti, again, so if we are going to be talking about the authors and how they wrote about the pandemic, well, I've described how they write about it. So they tell you that it kills, and we all know that the illness kills indiscriminately. It does not see whether you're rich or poor, what caste or class you may belong to. But we all know that when it comes to, let's say, getting treatment, there is a certain class which will benefit, a certain class which will not. Um, what Foucault is saying, that there is always this division that is there, and the political class will always want to keep the divisions alive, because their political credibility remains on keeping people separated rather than having people unite. So, and another thing about crisis situations is that people unite momentarily and then they again dissipate. So while a calamity might bring people together, but the minute the crisis is over or you're outside of that crisis, it again sort of dissipates. And if we look at it from our point of view, what we faced, well, we were extremely, class conscious, is what I will say. I'm talking about the high-rise buildings. With the first things that they did was they stopped the entrance of the domestic helps, knowing fully well that those people are entirely dependent. Your salaries have to go to them, otherwise they have no way of surviving. And then that horrifying migration that happened, the migrant laborers having to leave, and the death and destruction, and the horrors that they had to face. So it was very definitely, the social divide was very clear. So while you did see, you had both the things, what Foucault is talking about. While you had a certain set of society uniting in order to take care, you had the civil society rise up to take care, but you also had the civil society which blocked itself in, did not allow people, did not give them salaries, forced people to leave, did not even shed a tear when they died. So you also had that. So it played out parallelly, so to say.
Okay.
I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, ma'am, that answers it. Thank you, ma'am.
It's very